If there's one thing about video games that I really cannot stand, it's neglected game mechanics or archetypes, especially when said feature is heavily involved in player experience. For example, one of the reasons why the Genshin community, myself included, is so butthurt about endgame content or lack thereof is because endgame content is an aspect of a video game's experience that affects everyone, casual free-to-plays and hardcore whales alike. It doesn't necessarily have to apply to something on a universal scale, but if it's integrated into the game alongside other systems that affect the entire game, that's when it becomes a noticeable sore spot for one's quality of enjoyment. Genshin Impact's gameplay revolves around the 7 elements, with each character corresponding to one of them, as well as those elements having significant influence in combat through reactions, resonance, and type matchups. However, there's technically an 8th element, physical, one of the 8 damage types, and the only one that isn't considered elemental damage. All weapon types, with the exception of Catalyst, deal physical damage by default, but physical damage exists in a small group of characters' talents and is formally acknowledged by the game as a veritable combat stat on account of the presence of physical damage augmentation in stuff like artifacts and reactions. Despite that, the physical element has effectively been forgotten ever since version 2.0 well over a year ago, its last noteworthy character being Eula. Earlier this year I made a video on physical damage dealers, discussing whether it's viable or not. We're well into version 3, and in the spirit of my Element miniseries I thought to revisit this topic, which at this point might as well be an obituary to physical damage. Today, we're going to talk about the forgotten archetype of Genshin Impact, and why miHoYo has ostensibly neglected it. Like I said earlier, though it occupies only a small portion of playable characters and whatnot, physical damage is one of the 8 forms of damage in this game, therefore several weapons, talents, artifacts, and even an elemental reaction feature physical damage, so it's as relevant to Genshin as the normal type is to Pokemon. Being elementless, physical damage doesn't innately interface with Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, Anemo, Electro, Geo, and Dendro, but by combining Electro and Cryo together, you achieve Superconduct, dealing cryo damage to all enemies in the area and reducing their physical resistance by 40%. 2 artifact sets are correlated to physical damage as well, Bloodstained Chivalry and Pale Flame, both having a 2-piece bonus that increases the wearer's physical damage by 25%. Interestingly, the elemental counterparts only boost their correlated element's damage by 15%. Several weapons also deal physical damage as part of their passive, notably the Skyward series, while others directly increase your physical damage, such as the Aquila Favonia, making this the only element to be a secondary stat as none of the other elements have a corresponding weapon. As you can see, without even looking at the characters, there's more than enough evidence to prove that physical is more than just the default damage weapons do. There are systems, items, and artifacts in place to elevate its strength. Speaking of the characters, since every playable unit except Traveler carries a vision, that means there are no inherent physical characters, thus only being unofficially labeled as physical dealers by way of their stats and/or abilities. The first one to be labeled as such was Razor all the way back in version 1, an Electro Claymore user whose passive stat boosted his physical damage by 30% at level 90. Although he's a bit of a weird case, neither his elemental skill nor burst have anything to do with physical damage, rather he focuses on attack speed. With no weapon in view on deck and his passive stat of choice being physical damage, put 2 and 2 together. The other 2 characters do have physical damage explicitly stated in their repertoire, each possessing some form of it on their elemental burst. Xinyan's Rift Revolution deals an initial massive burst of physical damage before exploding in a small amount of pyro damage over time. Based on the number scaling, we can infer which stat is the more valuable one. You may notice that Xinyan's damage scaling is quite impressive for a 4-star, dealing up to 724% at rank 13, something you would only really see on a 5-star. This is even more noticeable on Eula's Glacial Illumination, dealing a solid amount of cryo damage before applying a stacking buff on her for the next 7 seconds, increasing the subsequent aftershocks damage for every auto attack and elemental skill that successfully hits an opponent. Assuming max rank, the Lightfall Sword's base damage is 922%, and if somehow you find a way to acquire the full 30 stacks of power, Eula has by far, beyond the shadow of a doubt, the highest damage scaling in a single blow out of any character period, at 6,575.17%. Others may come close, such as Ayaka, whose burst totals roughly 6,000, but that's spread out over multiple hits, and your 3 tornadoes have to stay on the same target. Either way, the number scaling for physical units is staggering, but therein lies one of the most concerning design problems of physical damage, which I'll briefly recap. Aware that they'll gain no benefit from elemental reactions due to not being an element themselves, physical units have far fewer options for external DPS improvement, meaning they're essentially left to their devices and what little support they can get from each other. So, for them to remain competitive, physical units need significantly higher numbers on all aspects of their gameplay because elemental reactions literally make or break certain characters, and without them they would be complete dog water. That's the only reason Sucrose, Shanding, Xingqiu, Hutao, so on and so forth are anywhere near as broken as they are. Superconduct does shred physical res by 40%, but there are no elemental reactions that deal physical damage, so the only things that get stronger are your normal attacks, and in Xinyan and Eula's case, their elemental burst damage. That's it, you get nothing else but that. One would think the increased numbers on their abilities and greater access to enhancements like the 2-piece set bonuses or the artifacts given 25% instead of 15% and the existence of bonus physical damage on weapons are enough to compensate for the lack of assistance from reactions, and at first glance, that was somewhat true. Even though Razor greatly fell off, and Xinyan was, with all due respect, never good to begin with, Eula easily held her own against the 5 stars available at the time. She wasn't the best, mind you, but certainly good enough to be worth investing in. However, since physical is completely isolated from everything, that also meant that as time progressed, not only did the archetype receive no new characters to bolster its roster in line with the others, but there was no possibility of receiving indirect buffs either, resulting in them being unable to keep up with the growing collective strength of everyone else, or in layman's terms, power creep has all but shoved them out of relevance. There were several units throughout Genshin's timeline who started out weak or underwhelming but got better over time thanks to new content. The most prominent case being Electro, whose characters have shot up in value considerably through the addition of Dendro. A lesser example would be Yoimiya, who, despite still not being the most popular, has seen progressively higher usage by virtue of new units being introduced who help her do her job more efficiently like Yunjin and Yelan. Altogether, the physical element has gotten absolutely zero improvements to their capabilities whatsoever. No new characters, worthwhile weapons, artifacts, nothing. Don't worry, I haven't forgot about Eula and Raiden Shogun, I'll get to that later. But it's been like this for almost a year and a half. The question is, why? Why has MiHoYo discontinued support for physical units when they went so far as to make entire artifact sets and characters tailored to it? I can't speak for them, but after some deliberation, I came to a very simple conclusion. Physical damage, more specifically physical units, should never have existed in the first place. Before the Eula, Razor, and Xinyan mains begin freaking out, let me explain. To start, what is the essential experience of Genshin's combat? The elements. The majority of your battles consist of intersecting elemental applications to form a reaction using the various units you have at your disposal. It's exceedingly rare for you to unintentionally not pull off reactions, as the game is designed to encourage or outright force you to do so. So while physical damage is present, it's primarily there for the sake of needing a control group. Just like how in Pokemon games, most non-specific utility attacks like Protect, Safeguard, Growl, Defense Curl, etc. are all normal type. It's the independent variable, so to speak. To hammer the point home even further, Genshin's playable characters are all meant to possess a vision, even physical users. Razor's Electro, Xinyan is Pyro, Eula is Cryo. It's entirely possible for whatever sources of physical damage that are present in their kit to be altered to elemental damage without compromising their experience. Eula will play out exactly the same way if her Lightfall Swords dealt cryo damage because physical has no exclusive function. The inverse, however, would be noticeable. If an elemental attack became physical, it would lose a lot of properties that could not be made up for. So there's no fundamental reason for anything to be physical. Therefore, physical damage will not and cannot ever be better than elements without going against the essential experience of Genshin Impact, as it's an objectively inferior and more importantly incomplete way to play the game as intended by the developers. One might say the only major difference between physical damage and elemental is the gap in damage, since reactions are ultimately meant to just increase your damage barring maybe freeze. True, but trying to compensate by increasing physical attacks damage scaling like how they did with Eula doesn't conclusively level her on the same playing field as that of Hu Tao, Ayaka, or Shogun because damage calculation is not just a percent scaling on abilities. Reactions, for instance, can be increased through elemental mastery. Entire characters base their damage off EM. Now say if we try to account for that and buff the damage scaling on physical attacks even further. That much artificial inflation has the adverse effect of making physical units too strong, hence why they added a condition to Eula's Lightfall Sword where the 6500% is not guaranteed, you have to stack it up beforehand. They can't just let her pull it off for free, otherwise that would be broken, which brings me to the second problem. Elemental reactions are the backbone of every party composition we know today. Freeze comps are formed around achieving freeze as efficiently as possible, taser teams abuse electrocharged, and swirl, so on and so forth. Seeing as physical units have nothing to gain from those reactions, they also have nothing to contribute to those teams, making them insular characters. Now technically there are ways characters like Eula and Xinyan can receive support outside of reactions. Shogun's elemental skill increases the elemental burst damage of her party. However, excluding personal attachment for a moment, why would you want to use her elemental skill on a physical damage dealer when she can boost an elemental damage dealer's burst in subsequent reactions instead? Once again, there's no practical incentive to prioritize physical units over elemental. Physical and Geo largely suffer from the same issue of insularity, except Geo is still able to benefit from elemental boosts as it's an element. Case in point, physical is too isolated from the other elements that the only way it can receive support is through direct additions, not indirect. With these two issues in mind, trying to maintain physical's relevance is simply not a worthwhile endeavor from a logistical and business standpoint. Releasing an elemental character has a higher chance of accruing more sales because they have two incentives, their individual abilities as well as their interactions with other characters through reactions. Raiden Shogun herself is very strong, but she also vastly improves the national team. Kokomi's hydro damage isn't half bad and her healing is one of the best in the game, while facilitating elemental reactions for her team. Kuki Shinobu is an electro healer who works harmoniously with Hyper Bloom. The more situations a character can be used in, the higher the chances of them being pulled for. But then again, Eula's character demo is the 4th most viewed video on Genshin's YouTube channel. My point still stands though, if they were to release a physical unit right now, they would have to supplement the effectiveness of physical damage dealers to such a game-breaking extent, and or offer a general benefit that allows them to see use outside of physical teams to make players consider using their hard-earned primo gems on them. But if they went the latter approach, offering a general benefit in the same vein as how Bennett supports everyone, not just Pyro, the power ceiling of every party will increase, putting physical damage in the same situation as before, vastly behind the other elements. Nothing will change. The only option is to make a solely dedicated physical user. So, is it possible to balance physical damage to be just as viable as the regular elements, even without access to reactions and whatnot? Yes and no. On one hand, Genshin Impact is a player versus environment game, or PvE. It's not like units are actively compared to each other in a competitive format such as League of Legends. On the other hand, gacha games are somewhat unique in this regard. It's true that they're single-player games by nature, but the way the genre is designed implicitly pressures you to seek out the most efficient ways to do things, or in other words, there still is some semblance of a meta. And the reason they do that is to sell you characters. Those of you who played other gachas have likely experienced this scenario before. A new dungeon or boss is released with a brand new mechanic that makes it so the only way you can efficiently clear it is by using a new combat system. It just so happens that coincidentally, the new banner features a character that has the very same combat system. Totally not suspicious. Sure, Spiral Abyss and everything can be completed with a team consisting of Lisa, Kaya, Amber, and Traveler. By extension, you can still make a functioning endgame team with Eula, Racer, or Xinyan. It will just be far less efficient, more time-consuming, costs more investment, and even with all that, you'll probably still have trouble. Granted, Genshin is far more casual friendly and doesn't require you to have the most optimal artifacts, weapons, or even characters to complete the entire game, even Spiral Abyss. All the same, as mentioned in my episode on Pyro, players are naturally lazy. We want to find the path of least resistance. There may be a small faction of players who enjoy making things more challenging for the sake of it, but if it's not imposed by the game itself, whoever doesn't care about that won't care. Assuming we disregard the logistical obstacles, the way they can make physical damage relevant again without having to add new systems or rework existing ones is to take a similar approach to what they did with Geo, embracing their insularity by encouraging players to go monophysical, although that has its own tribulations. Physical units are extremely reliant on superconduct to achieve just about anything, but superconduct requires at least one source of electro and one source of cryo, leaving you with not that much room for party variety. Conveniently, Racer and Eula already fit one side of the equation, but if they were to release new physical units in the future who are Hydro, Dendro, Geo, Anima, or Pyro, 3 of your party slots are locked out, so they have to release an artifact set or weapon that can pull off a 40% res break to replace superconduct to free up more slots. I think out of all elements, physical is the one that's in most need of a Goro type support. Although how can they even manage that? There's no elementless units, so it's not like they can say you need 4 physical damage dealers on your team. Everyone has an element, even if it's by name only. Yeah, the physical element is definitely in a tough spot. In my video earlier this year on them, I suggested we make physical units breakers, whereby they can fit in as a support, but if they have something like a 25 defense break, that doesn't solve the root problem of physical DPS being so much worse than elemental. Then again, we have no dedicated sword or polearm user yet. Every physical character is not only an on-field DPS, but also a claymore user. Perhaps there might be a sword physical damage dealer that would turn things around, but they would have to be exceptionally powerful, enough to challenge the might of reactions. Honestly, it's quite a shame that physical has become so forgotten. I actually thought it was a breath of fresh air that there were even physical units to begin with. For free-to-plays, the early days of Genshin were carried by Racer, and so many people are fans of Eula, at least in terms of character appeal. I know right now miHoYo's attention is on Dendro, but it would be nice if they went back and breathed new life into physical. Either that, or they should retroactively rework Xinyan, Racer, and Eula to just be elemental damage dealers. You either go all in or don't do it at all. Half-assing a game system never turns out well. But what are your thoughts on this? Do you still hold out hope that miHoYo hasn't forgotten about physical, or is it just completely dead? Let me know in the comments down below. That's it for today though, so if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe, it really helps out the channel. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my previous episodes on Pyro, Dendro, and Geo if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.